Okay, so this is part two for the story of the Vietnam door gunner. So this kid who went to Vietnam and at first in Vietnam became lucky enough to become chosen to become a combat driver who drove the supreme commander of the base around. So he was a combat driver for the commander. It was ultimately a very lucky job he got, and it was safe enough because the commander was well protected. Ultimately the commander was basically had a huge protection, and so even though he was in a combat environment, they took every precaution to defend the life of the commander, which meant that he was protected by being a combat driver. He was pretty protected in Vietnam. He was a lucky spot, and so after getting too comfortable with the commander and drinking, he liked to drink a lot. Ultimately, he as a driver, you can't drink, and ultimately, but he would sneak the drink, and the commander would eventually find out that he's drinking and driving. He would try to hide it, and ultimately he'd get caught and fired. When the commander, he wanted to drink, he just couldn't stop or wouldn't stop, and so the commander would remove him, fire him, and tell him, you'll be reassigned to a place where you can drink all you want. And ultimately, they assigned him as a door gunner. Door gunners could stay loaded all the time, really. And I mean, if they did, no one said nothing. They had a life expectancy of about 2 weeks, and they'd usually get shot up and be in the hospital and replaced. That's what happened to most door gunners. They were injured by being shot up, and then they would be replaced or killed, and a lot of them were killed. So basically, about every 2 weeks, there would be another door gunner that would go down and be dead or in the hospital and replaced. So he went from relatively safe to in jeopardy, heavy jeopardy, uh, because he could drink now. Basically, that was the commander's way of telling him, you didn't appreciate me. You could have been having a great, safe job, but you insisted on drinking, and you wouldn't do as I asked, and you disrespected me. And basically, I'll put you in a place where you can drink all you want, and no one's going to say anything. You could be a helicopter door gunner, and you can stay loaded all the time if you like, and do whatever you want. So ultimately, he did it, and he survived two pretty bad crashes. The helicopter had to make emergency landings like twice and crashed, where the helicopter was destroyed. Basically, it would roll and major crash, but basically at low altitudes. And so the first two crashes he got into ultimately really toughened him up because he didn't end up dying, and he went through the trauma and he handled it. So he became proud of himself. And after surviving two crashes, low altitude emergency landings where the helicopter was destroyed, everyone survived, and basically he started to become more competent. And the third crash was at high altitude. There was no saving him because basically they were probably up about 14,000 feet. You can imagine a Huey helicopter at 14,000 feet is pretty. It doesn't even seem like reasonable to believe it would be up that high, but that's what how high he was about maybe 12 to 14,000 feet in a Huey. Now, why would they be up that high? Well, because they could escape the ground fire, they'd stay as high as they could. So sometimes the Hueys would fly at their ceiling level, which I think is about 14,000 feet, 12 to 14,000 feet. And they would stay up there at night, especially as high as they could. So basically they could avoid ground fire and surface-to-air missiles or whatever. It basically, at least RPG fire, and that's what would, in the third time he crashed, the details of the story are amazing. So he was at high altitude, headed back to base after patrol, and it was late at night, and the commander was with him. The commander did go on dangerous missions, and ultimately the commander was also had a contingent of every kind of bodyguard, and there was a big army surrounding the commander all the time. So basically the commander would go out there in the field and put himself in danger, but he had a kick butt army with him. And but the commander didn't always go out, and he'd go out once in a while. So one night they were late at night traveling back, high altitude. They were up 14,000 feet in the air and going back to base, and I don't know if it's 14,000 feet. That's what 12 to 14,000 feet is what the information I get. And the last thing he did, understand that the commander became very irritated with him because the commander treated him right at first, and he was a celebrity, kind of like, the combat driver, the kid who was lucky enough to have a personal relationship with the commander. So basically, he should have considered an honor to have that commander agreed to let that kid be his driver, because he did believe that kid, even though he was a kid, was an excellent driver. He thought you could be a race car driver. He said, you have a skill, boy. You know how to drive like a man, like a badass. You can drive, boy. I like the way you drive. And ultimately, he could do it. He could burn out, peel out, and he could maintain control of the car under extreme conditions where maybe it would be out of control if someone else was behind the wheel. Ultimately, he had a great opportunity, and he blew it because he wouldn't stop drinking. And then he would be, now as a door gunner, he would be up in the air, and the commander was behind him. Now understand that basically the last thing that happened was he had earplugs on, but he could still hear, and or earmuffs or whatever they got, their hearing protection, but he could still hear, and he heard an RPG go off behind him, behind the helicopter. It was close at 12 to 14,000 feet. Well, the RPG that went off was maybe a half a mile behind him. So he knew it had to have been coming from a helicopter behind him. So he knew the moment he heard the RPG or the missile, it was some kind of a hand-fired missile came from maybe a couple hundred meters behind his helicopter. Someone fired a freaking RPG or a missile, a handheld missile or something, and he heard it go off, and he said, "Holy shit, that's coming from one of us." Well, it happened to be coming from the commander's helicopter, because the commander, the story goes, the commander was so fed up with the kid that somebody fired it it was like on purpose or something. Like they killed him. But basically, whatever happened, it was on purpose. And basically, the last thing he could do was fasten his seatbelt or pull it tighter, because he heard it coming. He didn't know if it was coming at his helicopter. He knew it was coming towards his helicopter, and he was in formation with other helicopters around him. He didn't know who was going to hit or if it was going to hit him, but he knew, holy, here we go, like coming this way, man, incoming. And it happened to be coming right at him. So the last thing he could do was fasten his seatbelt and prepare for an impact. And boy, oh boy, did he get it up the rear end of the helicopter. So whatever it was, an RPG probably, fired off, and it hit him, and it blew him. When it blew up, it literally blew him out of the helicopter, literally out. And his flight jacket actually got jammed onto the rear skid of the helicopter, like jammed onto it. So his flight jacket caught, when he got blown out of the helicopter, his flight jacket caught the rear skid, and he was literally on it. That flight jacket is strong, and it was literally on the rear skid. He was stuck. He was just suddenly on the rear skid, literally by the back of the flight jacket, just hanging there. After he got blown out of the helicopter, when it exploded, blew him out onto the skid. Now he's hanging by his flight jacket. He's on there, on that skid, tightened, like he ain't coming off. And the helicopter's going down. So they're fighting to try to control the helicopter, try to keep it under control. It's not going to happen. The helicopter's blown in pieces, half. It's going down, and they're trying to keep it. It's all over the sky, and it's coming down. And he starts his ascent when it blows up, and he's on the rear skid now of the helicopter. He falls 6 miles. And to be exact, the exact distance was 6 miles at speed of over 100 miles an hour, and at about 14,000 feet. and at an angle, he from the time the helicopter got hit to the time that he actually hit the ground, well, it was at least 8 to 12 minutes that he was in the air. So like it was a long time that he was in the air, and like after he got hit, the helicopter didn't hit the ground in no minute or two. It was 8 to 10, 12 minutes before that helicopter hit the ground. It was coming down. They were trying to keep it up. They were trying to fly it. It was not going to fly, and it was going down pretty fast. And he was on the rear skid. He got to ride the helicopter all the way down 6 miles to the ground, and he had plenty of time to think about everything. Everything that happened. So at first he was really drunk and hanging on that skid. At first, adrenaline is his blood's pumping, the adrenaline's going, and he's basically thinking, well, I'm gonna die anyways. He starts saying, "Hail Jesus, hail Jesus, hail Jesus, hail Jesus, hail God, God, praise God, hail Jesus." And that's what he said. Screaming out, screaming over and over. He said it for like at least 5 to 10 minutes. He was screaming over and over, hail, praise God, hail Jesus, praise Jesus. That's all he did over and over. And he did it for several minutes while they were struggling to keep the helicopter up, and it was not going to even, and he's hanging on the rear skid of the helicopter underneath it. He had plenty of time to think about what was going to happen to him as he was going down with the helicopter. On the rear skid underneath it by his flight jacket, which had literally launched onto it. Like he was on that skid. There's no way he's coming off it. That flight jacket got really, he was stuck. And as he went down and he was saying, hail Jesus, hail, praise God, all that shit, because he was drunk and loaded and adrenalated. Well, after about 4 or 5 minutes of that, he started to relax and calm down and realize and get his wits about him. And he started realizing he's still going through the air, coming towards the ground, knowing what's going to happen. And he starts to actually sober up and suddenly come to his senses of what is about to take place. He's going to die. And suddenly he becomes a scared little kid, and the alcohol and drugs don't help him anymore. And he starts to really start to flip out. Pray, God, please help me. Don't let me die. Like, I don't want to go this way. This is like, yeah, like ultimately suddenly he's crying. He's screaming out, no, don't let it. So suddenly he can't contain this tough guy persona anymore, and he loses it at about 6 minutes, 7 minutes into the descent. He knows he's dead in just a minute or two. See, he's thinking he has plenty of time to clarity think about it. He is utterly terrified, and God is behind this whole thing. Yeah, God is traumatizing me on purpose. He's saying, "Boy, you disrespect Vietnamese women. You like to fight the divine feminine collective. You want to battle women. You want to call that stupid, all that stupid, to the Vietnamese girls. You want to do this, boy? I had you go through 2 crashes. This is your 3rd crash, boy. You're not going to make it this time." And ultimately, he didn't even know that God would be telling him that, because God wouldn't even let him know what was going on. He wouldn't even pray to God. However, God was telling him, you better get it right, boy. It was in his own consciousness, and he probably wouldn't have even related it to even being God.